Good morning, class. Of course, I thoroughly apologize for my lateness, but, having a 3-year-old has its perks. In any case, thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate y'all trying to hear some of our words here. And I'm super honored that I'm on a panel with so many established, respected colleagues, people who I've looked up to for the last few years, in fact. My story is pretty simple. I graduated from Syracuse University of about, 11 years ago, trying to figure out what my life was going to turn into and how I was going to do things. Before then, I had lived the better part of 2 decades in the Lower East Side, which was New York City, which is predominantly like Latino and Black. Like it was mostly that, with of course a mix of Asian and Jewish folks as well. So it was a fairly populated, area there until MTV took over, and now it's like totally gentrified. But we won't talk about that. I guess at some point I started seeing patterns in my own schooling that led me to where I am now. So going from Head Start all the way through 6th grade, I was looking at again, mostly diverse student population with mostly Jewish teachers. And I went to, I went to like a sample bar mitzvah, which was kind of interesting, like in 5th grade. I said, okay, this is how y'all do, that's cool, y'all party as well. And it was a neighborhood in transition when I was growing up, so that's what we were learning. So I was learning these sort of cultures as I was growing up until I went to Nativity Mission School for 7th and 8th grade. Now that was almost all Latino, and I think it was almost all Dominican, in fact, except for maybe a couple of Mexican students and a couple of Puerto Rican students. But generally, it was mostly Dominican. And again, looking at everything, my teachers were almost all white. I had about 2 or 3 teachers who were just coming from Harvard, for example, and were trying to just give back. So that was my vision. Those are the things that I saw. When I went to high school, on the other hand, it was almost all white. It was about 76%. I went to Xavier High School in Manhattan, almost all white teachers, almost all white students. There was a sprinkle of us here and there. It was like a big bowl of milk and some Cocoa Puffs inside it, and it's not like the Cocoa Puffs were able to get the rest of the milk to be chocolatey. It didn't work that way. Like, it's a good metaphor for the morning. I guess what I think about is, all right, so I was prepared to go to Syracuse University, again, predominantly white institution. We even if they embrace diversity as part of their core mission, but at the same time, I really started to see that in order for me to affect change, I needed to become a teacher myself. Now, when I graduated, I had no sort of employment whatsoever. Like, I had no sort of outlook, like say, oh, I can go work in Wall Street, I can go do this and that, whatever. I just became more and more passionate about becoming a teacher. And even if it meant that I wasn't going to get the best salary possible, starting salary in New York City, you say, oh, $46,000, that's not that bad. $46,000 in New York City is pretty minimal, and it's hard to scrape by. So I was living in my mom's house for like a good decade there. For me, when I think about the teacher shortage, the minority teacher shortage, if you will, I think Richard Ingersoll's work on this is fantastic, and I think it's worth looking at. But let me give you just a bit of a lens as to what he's talking about from my perspective. So when I walk in a school building, for example, and I know if it's a high poverty school building, I'm almost sure in New York City that half of that staff is either Black, Latino, or Asian. And I looked at the latest numbers from the Independent Budget Office. That sounds about right. So it's about half. The other problem is, too, though, when you walk in that building, you're wondering whether or not your colleagues are still going to be there. And not simply because of working conditions, though that's a huge deal. It's also because we have a political climate right now that suggests that if schools don't perform at the best possible rate, then they may get shut down. So that's another part of it too. There's this element that, yes, we walk in there and we have a bit of, I'll call it trauma, if you will, thinking about how our schooling should match up with whatever our kids feel. And if we see kids that look like us when we were younger, and they have the least adequate education possible, then that's a trauma that we need to address. Because when you see kids that look like you in a school that's poorly serving them, then you don't want to be there. Those are things that matter, and that is what we would call institutional racism. So it's not so much about people being mean. It's about people not giving adequate resources. It's about constantly being stripped of resources. It's about resources being tied to VAM scores and test scores and this, that, whatever, instead of good, strong pedagogy. I even think back to, and I'm not going to say think back because I wasn't alive back then, but I think about there was a Black Teachers Union back a good 50 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, I have more numbers people here than me, so I apologize if I got it wrong. But when I started doing the research, I started to see that with this Black Teachers Union, they actually want to focus more on pedagogy than any sort of workers' rights, union rights, etc. I mean, those came secondary and tertiary. Like, yes, we need to collectively bargain. We need to do all these things that matter for our working conditions. But most importantly was about pedagogy, because we need to address students in a certain way that is adaptable to their cultural competence. And to that end, when I walk into a school building, my first intent is to build relationships with the students in front of me. That's my first intent. Second intent is to make sure that I can at least deliver a sort of care for the students. And the way that I show care, which is tertiary, is by the way that I do my instruction. And if I become an effective pedagogue, then everything else falls into line. Now, is it always going to be perfect? Not exactly. You know, we have all these variables. But I walk in here, and now I've been teaching here for 10 years now. And I've been teaching in the same school building, predominantly Latino, 66% English language learner. I have a lot of students who need a lot of help. But do I think I'm a plus for having stayed there? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to be harder to recruit people like me to come into school buildings when they see that the students are not necessarily fully served, even though people are trying their best? Absolutely. I mean, school closures, school shutdowns, school, etc., all that matters. And autonomy matters too. Now, this word autonomy, I'm also thinking too, it's not just about saying, I think I know what I have to do for my kids. It's also what sort of curricular materials will best apply to the students that are in front of me. Can I take them on trips? Can I do this? Can I do? If you cannot do these things and give kids more experiences like the ones that I had when I had growing up, then it's really hard to say, you know what, as a Black teacher, as a Latino teacher, even if you think you have all the passion in the world, it can be really, really frustrating. Day after day, I get emails from different teachers who tell me, it would be great if I was able to do the things that you do, but unfortunately, I have to follow this script for this lesson in this exact way at every single moment. I have to be on top of my game every single time that I'm in there, or else my voice doesn't get preferred. I don't get opportunities to talk about my expertise. These are things that matter. These are things that matter. And I barely mentioned salary, right? So I always think, okay, so if we're talking about salary, every time that we are able to bump up one teacher's salary, we can do that for every single body. So if it works for the quote-unquote lowest common denominator or the special group that we want to work with, it'll work for everybody. And that matters a lot too. A lot of us who are first-generation college students, for example, have a really hard time managing living in the city, for example, and then trying to give back to our parents, which I know a lot of us have to do. In fact, that is why there are so many of us, particularly males of color, who often feel like they have to go into administration in order to supplement whatever they have to kick back to their parents. That matters a lot as well. And I don't want to go too deep into it because I don't want to be too malicious, but I often feel like there is a reason. There is not the political will to make this truly happen in a real way. So you can have all these recruitment efforts. You can have this teach.this, black males go do this, rise, dream, do this. But then if they can't rise, dream, and do on a continual basis, if you can't support them all the way through, if you can't do the things that will keep them in that classroom, and then address in a really substantive way the sorts of institutional privileges that we constantly have to address. You know, I always tell people, I think teachers, you know, specifically teachers of color, need to get at least a PD credit for every time they have to explain a racial situation to it. You're clapping because you know what I'm talking about. It's like, you know, you may have like those one or two teachers who all the students of color always turn to, and everybody's like, oh, why do they do that? Oh, it's because he's a male teacher of color. It's because she's a woman teacher of color. It's like, it's also because there are things that we do that we kind of already understand. And if you have that gift, we'll teach it to you. But if you refuse to be taught, then that becomes hard to do. These are just my thoughts real quick. And I know that I got a bunch of things to say, but I have people who are so much more eloquent about these things than I am. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.